The restaurant sat on the corner of a long avenue in downtown Seattle, its glass front reflecting the gray morning sky and the quiet ambition of a city that rarely slept. Inside, the air carried the smell of roasted coffee beans, butter warming on steel, and something citrus that the kitchen manager insisted made guests feel awake before their first bite. The place catered to business lunches and late dinners, the kind where deals were discussed in half sentences and people checked their watches more often than the menu. Amani Brooks arrived before sunrise, as she always did. She tied her hair back with careful fingers, the same way every morning, and slipped into her uniform with a practiced calm. At 26, she had learned the rhythm of the restaurant better than some of the managers. She knew which tables wobbled, which customers tipped in silence, and which ones watched her as if trying to measure her worth with their eyes. She knew how to move through all of it without letting her shoulders tighten. To most people, Amani was just a waitress. She carried plates, memorized orders, and smiled at the right moments. What they did not see was the way her mind moved, quick and layered, always several steps ahead. Her teachers had called her gifted when she was younger, then stopped calling at all when funding dried up, and her family needed her income more than her report cards. She learned anyway. She learned in the quiet hours, with borrowed books and language tapes, with free lectures streaming through an old laptop balanced on a crate in her apartment. By the time she could legally vote, she spoke 7 languages well enough to argue philosophy in them, and several more well enough to understand what people thought they were hiding. She never told anyone about the number attached to her intelligence. Numbers made people uncomfortable, or worse, dismissive. She had learned that being underestimated was sometimes safer. That morning, the restaurant manager, a man named Carl with a voice trained for authority, but eyes that slid past her, handed her the seating chart. He paused a moment longer than necessary, then reminded her to keep smiling during the lunch rush. Amani nodded, already planning the flow of tables in her head. She did not remind him that her section had the highest customer satisfaction rating for 3 quarters in a row. By noon, the place filled with the low roar of conversation. Silverware chimed against plates. Glasses clinked. The door opened and closed with steady urgency. Amani moved through it all like a current, carrying orders, listening more than she spoke. At 1:15, a group entered that shifted the room's attention without anyone quite knowing why. 4 men in tailored suits stepped inside, followed by a woman who carried herself like someone used to being heard. At their center was a man with silver at his temples and a posture that suggested restraint rather than ease. He took in the room with quiet focus, eyes noting exits, table spacing, the way the staff moved. His accent, when he spoke to the hostess, was Japanese, precise and measured. The hostess hesitated. She smiled too widely, asked him to repeat himself, then gestured vaguely toward a corner table. The man nodded, though his expression showed he had asked something specific that went unanswered. Amani noticed all of it from across the room. Carl approached the table himself, perhaps sensing importance, perhaps sensing a chance to impress. The man spoke again, slower this time, explaining a reservation, a preference for privacy, a dietary restriction. Carl's smile thinned. He nodded without understanding, or without trying to. He assured them it would be fine. As Amani approached with water, she caught fragments of the conversation. The Japanese man was asking about a delay, about a call he needed to take, about whether the table could be moved farther from the open kitchen. His English was formal and careful, but his sentences were long, structured differently. Carl responded with short reassurances that did not answer the questions. Amani set the glasses down gently. She met the man's eyes for a brief moment, and something passed between them. Recognition without words. She switched languages smoothly, asking in Japanese if he preferred green tea or water while he waited. His shoulders lowered by a fraction. Relief crossed his face, followed by surprise. Before he could respond, Carl cleared his throat. He laughed lightly, as if amused by a private joke. He told Amani to stick to English, that the guests would manage. He said it loudly enough for the table to hear. The woman in the group frowned. One of the men shifted in his seat. The Japanese man looked from Carl to Amani, then back, confusion shading into something closer to discomfort. Amani felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, the kind that came from being corrected in public for something that had helped rather than harmed. She kept her face neutral. She apologized to the table in English and stepped back, giving them time to settle. As she walked away, she heard Carl mutter something about showing off. It was not the first time someone had suggested that her competence was a performance rather than a fact. She returned to her other tables, delivering orders, checking on refills. Yet her attention kept circling back. She listened from a distance as misunderstandings piled up at that corner table. The food arrived with ingredients the man had asked to avoid. The noise level made his call difficult. Each time he tried to clarify, someone answered a different question. At one point, a nearby diner laughed, mimicking the man's accent under his breath. His companion hushed him, glancing around, but the damage was done. The Japanese man heard it. His jaw tightened. Shame flickered across his face, quickly masked. Amani felt something sharp settle behind her ribs. Fear for the situation, for how easily dignity could be stripped in a room full of witnesses. Tenderness for a stranger navigating a foreign space with careful courtesy. Protectiveness she did not entirely understand yet. She thought of her own experiences, of people speaking past her, of assumptions layered over her presence like dust. She had learned to remain calm, to let the moment pass, because she knew where she stood in the larger picture of her life. She had plans that stretched far beyond this dining room, ambitions she nurtured quietly. Still, there were moments when silence felt like agreement. When Carl returned to the table, frustration clear in his voice, Amani followed at a respectful distance. The Japanese man was explaining, again, that he needed assurance about a contract dinner later that week, that this meeting mattered. Carl interrupted, telling him the restaurant was busy and that perhaps he should simplify his requests. The words landed heavily. Amani saw the woman in the group stiffen. She saw the man's hands curl slightly on the table's edge. She stepped forward then, her voice even. She translated, accurately and fully, without embellishment. She conveyed not only the words, but the intent, the respect embedded in the man's phrasing. She answered his questions in Japanese, then turned to Carl and summarized the needs in clear English. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Carl stared at her, his mouth opening, then closing. The Japanese man looked at Amani with gratitude, something like trust forming quickly. Carl recovered first. He told Amani to return to her section. He said he would handle it. His tone carried an edge, a warning. Amani nodded. She stepped back, though her pulse had quickened. She knew she had crossed an invisible line, one drawn by ego rather than policy. As the lunch rush thinned, whispers followed her movements. Some guests watched her with new curiosity, others with something closer to resentment. The hostess asked her quietly how she had learned Japanese. Amani smiled and said she liked languages. The Japanese man requested her service for the remainder of the meal. Carl hesitated, then agreed with a tight nod. At the table, the atmosphere softened. Conversation flowed more easily. The woman introduced herself as an executive assistant. The men spoke of markets, of timelines. Amani listened, understanding far more than she let on. When the check was paid, the tip left was generous but not ostentatious. The man bowed his head slightly in thanks, meeting her eyes again. He said something in Japanese about remembering kindness in unexpected places. After they left, Carl called Amani into the back. The kitchen noise swallowed part of his voice, but not the message. He told her she needed to know her place. He suggested that attention could be taken away as easily as it was given. Amani listened without interrupting. Shame brushed against her, not for what she had done, but for how familiar the reprimand felt. She also felt something else, quieter but stronger, a sense of justice not yet satisfied, ambitions stirring, reminding her that this room was not the limit of her world. She returned to the floor, her expression composed. The afternoon light shifted, casting longer shadows across the tables. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the small fractures forming inside the restaurant. As Amani wiped down a counter and prepared for the evening shift, she considered the pattern she had seen repeat itself too many times. Competence challenged, dignity tested, silence expected. She remained calm because she knew her status in life was not defined by the uniform she wore, nor by the narrow vision of those who underestimated her. What she did not yet know was how quickly the threads of that afternoon would tighten, how the man at the corner table and the words spoken and ignored would become part of something larger. The day had planted seeds of conflict that had not yet broken the surface, and Amani, steady on her feet, stood at the beginning of a path that would demand more than patience alone. The days after the lunch incident did not return to normal, though on the surface the restaurant looked the same. The same menus lay flat and clean, the same polished floors reflected the overhead lights, and the same soft music drifted through the dining room like it always had. Yet for Amani Brooks, the atmosphere had shifted. It carried a tension that was easy to miss if you were not the one standing in its center. Carl began assigning her fewer tables. When she asked why, his answer was vague, framed as efficiency, as balance, as something she should not take personally. He spoke in the tone of someone confident that his reasoning did not need explanation. Amani nodded, accepting the schedule changes with outward calm, even as she calculated the loss in tips and what that would mean for her rent. She adjusted, as she always had. What she did not adjust was her awareness. She noticed how conversations stopped when she entered the break room. She noticed how instructions were repeated to her that others received once. She noticed how her mistakes, minor and quickly corrected, were mentioned aloud, while others passed without comment. None of it was dramatic enough to protest without sounding defensive, and she knew that was part of the design. One evening, as she refilled a water pitcher, she overheard Carl speaking with another manager near the bar. He was laughing, saying something about employees who thought they were smarter than their position. He said it lightly, but the meaning carried weight. Amani kept walking. She had learned long ago that reacting in the moment often gave people the satisfaction they were seeking. Her restraint was not weakness, it was calculation. Outside of work, her life continued with its own demanding rhythm. She studied late into the night, reviewing financial reports and global market analyses on her laptop. She practiced languages she rarely had the chance to speak aloud, keeping them sharp, alive, She maintained contacts she had made online through academic forums and open lectures, people who knew her mind before they knew her face. To them, she was not a waitress. She was a thinker, a strategist, someone whose questions cut cleanly to the heart of complex systems. Still, the restaurant paid the bills, and for now, it was where the conflict pressed closest. The Japanese man returned the following week. This time, Amani noticed him the moment he stepped inside. He was alone, dressed more simply, without the entourage that had surrounded him before. He paused just inside the doorway, as if assessing whether he should proceed. The hostess smiled, the same practiced smile, and asked if he had a reservation. Before confusion could take hold again, Amani approached. She greeted him in English first, then shifted languages, asking how his day had been. His face brightened with recognition, relief evident in the way his shoulders eased. He said her name carefully, as if honoring it. Carl saw them. Amani felt his gaze before she heard his voice. He intercepted them, his smile stretched thin. He told the man that the restaurant was nearly full, that wait times were unpredictable. He suggested another location down the street. The man replied politely, explaining he had chosen this place intentionally. He mentioned the quality of the service during his last visit, his eyes flicking briefly to Amani. Carl's smile tightened further. He agreed to seat him, then instructed another server to take the table. Amani stepped back without protest. The decision was clear. As she moved away, she caught fragments of the conversation that followed. The man asked for Amani by name. The other server looked uncertain, glancing toward Carl. Carl shook his head once, sharply. Amani busied herself with side work, wiping surfaces that were already clean. The feeling that settled in her chest was familiar, a blend of frustration and something colder. It was not simply about being denied a table. It was about being erased from a narrative she had helped shape. Later that evening, as she passed near the man's table, she heard raised voices, not loud, but strained. The man was speaking carefully, choosing his words, while the server responded with confusion and impatience. Amani slowed her steps, listening. The issue was small but symbolic. An incorrect order, a misunderstanding that could have been easily avoided. She hesitated, then stepped in. She clarified, translating briefly, smoothing the exchange before it could harden. The man thanked her quietly. Carl appeared almost immediately. He told Amani to return to her duties. He said it in a way that suggested she was interfering, that her presence was the problem rather than the solution. Something shifted then, subtle but decisive. Amani felt the last of her patience settle into resolve. That night, after her shift, she received an email she did not expect. It was from the Japanese man, whose business card she had been given during the first lunch. He thanked her again for her help. He explained that he was in the United States negotiating a partnership that would affect hundreds of jobs, both here and abroad. He said communication mattered deeply in these discussions, and that misunderstandings could be costly. He asked if she would be willing to meet for coffee, off the clock, to assist with translation and cultural context. He assured her he would compensate her fairly. Amani read the message twice. She considered the implications. She thought of Carl's warnings, of the way power operated quietly, of the risks of stepping outside the narrow role others had assigned her. She also thought of the years she had spent preparing for opportunities exactly like this, even when she did not know what form they would take. She replied yes. They met in a small cafe near the waterfront, neutral ground far from the restaurant's watchful eyes. The man introduced himself properly this time, explaining his position as chief executive of a technology firm expanding into renewable infrastructure. He spoke openly, appreciating that he did not have to simplify his thoughts or worry about being misunderstood. Amani listened, asked questions, offered insights. She noticed the way his respect grew with each exchange, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it through clarity and depth. They spoke for hours, shifting easily between languages as needed. When they parted, he thanked her again, more formally. He said he valued discretion. He said opportunities often came disguised as inconveniences. Back at the restaurant, the atmosphere continued to sour. Carl called a staff meeting, ostensibly about customer service standards. As he spoke, his eyes lingered on Amani more than once. He emphasized hierarchy, the importance of knowing one's role. He reminded everyone that unauthorized interactions with guests could lead to consequences. Some of her coworkers avoided her gaze afterward. Others looked sympathetic but said nothing. Amani felt the isolation close in, but she did not let it bend her posture. She had endured worse than silence. The schedule for the next week was posted, and her hours were cut further. When she asked for clarification, Carl suggested she might want to reconsider her priorities. The implication was clear. Compliance would be rewarded, independence punished. Amani went home that night and opened her laptop. She reviewed contracts, market forecasts, internal reports the Japanese executive had shared with her under confidentiality. She saw patterns that others might miss, vulnerabilities hidden beneath optimistic projections. She drafted notes, questions, strategies. At the same time, she began documenting her experiences at the restaurant. Dates, times, witnesses, not with anger, but with precision. She understood systems. She knew how accountability worked when it worked at all. The conflict was no longer contained within a single dining room. It was unfolding across layers of her life, intersecting ambition with justice, patience with the need for action. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave for another coffee meeting, Carl stopped her near the exit. He asked where she was going. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. Amani answered honestly, without detail. She said she had commitments outside of work. Carl warned her again about distractions. He reminded her that positions were replaceable. She smiled politely and thanked him for his concern. As she stepped out into the street, the city noise swelling around her, Amani felt the weight of what was coming. She was being tested, pressed from multiple sides. The choices ahead would not be simple, and the cost of standing still was becoming clearer by the day. Somewhere between the restaurant's narrow expectations and the broader world opening before her, the conflict had taken root. It was no longer just about being understood. It was about who would control the narrative, and who would be forced to live inside someone else's version of it. The weeks that followed unfolded with a speed that felt both relentless and strangely methodical, as if events were aligning according to a logic only Amani could fully see. Her life split into parallel tracks. By day and evening, she moved through the restaurant with steady hands and a controlled expression, absorbing the quiet slights, the tightened schedules, the deliberate exclusions. Outside those hours, she stepped into rooms where her voice mattered, where the weight of her thoughts was measured not by her uniform, but by their precision. The coffee meetings with Kenji Nakamura became regular. He never treated them as favors or indulgences. Each meeting began with clear objectives, shared documents, and mutual respect. He paid her as a consultant, insisting on formal invoices, insisting that her time be valued properly. They discussed regulatory landscapes in the United States, labor expectations, public perception, and the delicate balance of entering a market that welcomed innovation but resisted unfamiliar leadership. Amani prepared meticulously. She reviewed legal frameworks late into the night, tracing how similar companies had stumbled not because their technology failed, but because they underestimated human response. She spoke candidly with Kenji about the unspoken rules of American corporate culture, about how language extended beyond words into tone, posture, and timing. He listened without interruption, taking notes, asking thoughtful questions. At the same time, the restaurant tightened around her like a narrowing corridor. Carl's behavior shifted from subtle pressure to calculated provocation. He corrected her in front of guests for minor deviations that others committed freely. He assigned her tasks outside her role, then criticized her for falling behind on her primary duties. When she requested clarification, he responded with rehearsed concern, implying she might be overwhelmed. Amani documented everything. She kept her notes factual, unemotional, aware that credibility depended on restraint. She noted witnesses, patterns, discrepancies. She did not share her records with anyone yet. She understood timing. Some coworkers distanced themselves, afraid of being associated with conflict. Others, quieter ones, began to offer small gestures of solidarity. A refill taken off her hands, a wordless nod. One server, Maya, lingered after a shift and admitted she had seen what was happening. She said she did not know how to help. Amani thanked her for saying something. That, too, mattered. The Japanese executive's presence in the city drew increasing attention. Articles appeared in business sections, speculating about partnerships and economic impact. Kenji's name was mentioned alongside projections of growth and cautious optimism. No one mentioned the waitress who had helped him navigate early conversations. Amani did not need recognition. She needed leverage. She found it in the details others overlooked. During one late-night review of documents, she noticed inconsistencies in a competing firm's public statements. Their claims about sustainability did not align with their supply chain disclosures. She cross-referenced data, drawing connections that suggested potential regulatory scrutiny. She brought it to Kenji's attention the next morning. He studied her analysis carefully. He asked how she had learned to read reports this way. Amani answered simply that she had practiced. The insight altered negotiation dynamics. Kenji's team adjusted their strategy, pressing where they had previously conceded. Meetings that had stalled began to move again. Invitations followed. Amani was asked to attend as an advisor, her role clearly defined, her contributions acknowledged. She entered those boardrooms aware of how she was perceived. Some people assumed she was an assistant. Others assumed she was there to take notes. She corrected no one directly. She waited. When she spoke with clarity that shifted attention without demanding it. The contrast between those rooms and the restaurant grew sharper. One evening, a customer complained that Amani's tone was unfriendly. Carl accepted the complaint without question. He wrote her up, citing professionalism. Amani read the notice, asked for specifics, and signed it without argument. She added the incident to her records. Later that night, she overheard Carl joking with a regular about people who needed to be reminded of their place. The regular laughed. Amani felt a familiar tightening in her chest, followed by something steadier. She reminded herself that the laughter did not define reality. Power was not always loud. Kenji invited her to a formal dinner with potential partners. The venue was another upscale restaurant across town. Amani chose her attire carefully, professional and understated. She watched recognition flicker across faces as conversations unfolded, and her competence became undeniable. Afterward, one executive pulled her aside and asked where she had trained. Amani answered honestly. The man looked surprised, then thoughtful. He said talent had a way of finding its path eventually. Eventually was not good enough. At the restaurant, the schedule posted for the upcoming month cut her hours to near minimum. The message was clear. When she asked Carl if there was an issue with her performance, he suggested she might consider whether the job was still a good fit. Amani went home and reviewed her finances. She could manage for a time, but the pressure was intentional. She recognized the tactic from textbooks and experience alike. Starve someone of resources, then offer relief contingent on compliance. She declined to comply. Instead, she requested a meeting with upper management. She presented her performance metrics, customer feedback, and schedule comparisons. The meeting was polite, non-committal. They promised to look into it. The following week, nothing changed. Kenji, meanwhile, asked her to sign a longer-term consulting agreement. The compensation was more than she had ever earned. She read the contract carefully, negotiated terms, and accepted. The work expanded, involving late calls across time zones and rapid turnarounds. She balanced it all with precision, refusing to let exhaustion compromise her standards. As her influence grew in one sphere, resistance hardened in the other. Carl began enforcing rules selectively. Amani was reprimanded for minor infractions, while others were excused. He criticized her demeanor, her pace, her interactions. Each correction was delivered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. One afternoon, he called her into the office and suggested that her outside commitments were distracting her. He implied that loyalty mattered. Amani listened, then asked if her work performance had declined. Carl deflected, returning to generalities. She left the office with her posture unchanged. That night, she met Kenji and his legal advisor to discuss public relations risks. The advisor listened as Amani outlined potential community concerns, emphasizing the importance of trust. The advisor asked how she understood these dynamics so well. Amani said she had lived them. The advisor nodded, making notes. The restaurant received notice of an upcoming corporate inspection tied to a potential investment deal. The rumor spread quickly. Carl grew more tense, more controlling. He demanded perfection, yet his own oversight slipped. Supply orders were delayed. Staffing gaps widened. Amani observed quietly. She noticed shortcuts taken, policies ignored. She recorded what she could without interfering. One evening, a confrontation unfolded on the floor. A customer grew impatient, raising his voice. Carl intervened poorly, escalating rather than calming the situation. Amani stepped in instinctively, diffusing tension with calm explanation and respectful tone. The customer settled, even apologized. Carl pulled Amani aside afterward and accused her of undermining him. His voice was low but sharp. He warned her again about consequences. Amani met his gaze steadily. She said nothing. She did not need to. The exchange was added to her records. The pressure followed her home. Anonymous comments appeared online under restaurant reviews, criticizing her specifically. She recognized the pattern, the attempt to isolate. She reported the reviews through proper channels and documented the timing. Kenji noticed her fatigue during a meeting and suggested she take a break. Amani declined, explaining she was managing a situation. He did not press, but his concern was evident. As negotiations progressed, Kenji's company moved closer to finalizing a major agreement. The announcement was imminent. Media interest intensified. Public scrutiny sharpened. Amani understood what that meant. Light exposed everything, not just the successes. She prepared accordingly. She organized her documentation into a coherent timeline. She cross-referenced policies, schedules, and communications. She identified patterns that demonstrated targeted behavior rather than coincidence. She consulted quietly with a labor advocate recommended through one of her academic contacts, asking hypothetical questions without revealing names. The advocate listened carefully and said the documentation was thorough. He said timing would be critical. At the restaurant, whispers circulated about impending changes. Some staff speculated about promotions, others about layoffs. Carl moved through shifts with forced confidence. Amani continued her work, outwardly unchanged. Kenji invited her to attend a press briefing as part of his advisory team. She accepted. The event took place in a modern conference center overlooking the city. Cameras flashed, questions flew. Kenji spoke with measured confidence, addressing concerns with transparency. When a reporter asked about community engagement, Kenji mentioned the importance of listening to voices often overlooked. His gaze flicked briefly toward Amani. The comment passed without elaboration, but it landed. Back at the restaurant, the mood was brittle. Carl watched the news clips on his phone during breaks. He avoided Amani's eyes. The inspection date arrived. Management scrambled. Policies were suddenly enforced across the board. Amani complied with every requirement, her conduct flawless. During the inspection, an issue surfaced related to staffing documentation. Carl attempted to explain. The inspector asked for records. There was confusion, delays. Amani observed from a distance. That evening, Carl confronted her, accusing her of disloyalty, of setting him up. The accusation was unfounded, but revealing. Amani listened, then calmly stated that she had followed all procedures. She reminded him that documentation protected everyone. His face flushed. He dismissed her abruptly. Amani went home and reviewed her materials one final time. The pieces were in place, though she knew the moment had not yet arrived. The situation was still in motion, still gathering force. She felt fear, not of failure, but of the magnitude of what confronting injustice required. She felt shame at how long she had been expected to endure quietly. She felt tenderness for those who lacked the means or support to push back, protectiveness toward her own future, ambition sharpened by clarity, a sense of justice that no longer felt abstract. As she prepared for another day straddling two worlds, Amani understood that the rising tension was not accidental. It was the necessary build toward a moment when truths would be forced into the open. She was no longer simply reacting. She was positioning herself deliberately, aware that the next shift could tip everything into confrontation. The story was still unfolding, its direction not yet sealed, but the momentum was undeniable. What had begun as a misunderstanding in a restaurant had grown into something that demanded reckoning, and Amani stood at the center of it, steady, watchful, ready. The morning everything shifted began like many others, with Amani waking before her alarm and lying still as the city gathered itself outside her window. Rain tapped lightly against the glass, steady and patient. She breathed through the familiar mixture of anticipation and caution that had become her companion. This day carried weight, not because she expected a single dramatic moment, but because too many threads had been drawn tight for nothing to give. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that could move between worlds without drawing attention. She reviewed her calendar, already memorized, then her notes, already refined. There was no hesitation left in her movements. Whatever fear lingered had settled into something quieter and more useful. At the restaurant, tension sat just beneath the surface, thin as glass. Staff spoke softly, glancing toward the office more often than usual. Carl arrived late, his smile brittle, his voice louder than necessary. He announced that a group of investors would be dining that evening, tied indirectly to a larger corporate development in the city. Expectations, he said, would be high. Amani listened without reaction. She noted the wording, the implications. Investors meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant exposure. Her schedule for the day placed her on the floor during the dinner rush, despite the recent cuts. The change was abrupt, unexplained. She suspected it was not a concession, but a calculation. If something went wrong, she would be visible. She prepared anyway. By late afternoon, messages began arriving from Kenji's team. The announcement they had been preparing for was scheduled for the following morning. Media outlets had confirmed attendance. Amani was included on the advisory list, her name appearing quietly among others. She read it once, then again, aware of how close two worlds were drifting. When the dinner rush began, the restaurant filled quickly. The investors arrived in pairs and trios, their conversations clipped and purposeful. Carl hovered, greeting them with exaggerated warmth. He reassigned tables on the fly, disrupting flow. Amani adapted, recalculating paths, smoothing delays before they could escalate. Then Kenji Nakamura entered. This time he was not alone, nor was he unannounced. His arrival carried a subtle shift, like a change in pressure. With him were two senior executives and a legal advisor. Their presence was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Carl froze for half a second too long. Amani saw it from across the room. She also saw the decision that followed, quick and defensive. Carl stepped forward, intercepting them before they could reach the hostess. His voice was loud enough to attract attention. He welcomed them effusively, speaking quickly, over-explaining. Kenji responded politely, his tone measured. He asked for a specific table. He asked if Amani Brooks was working. The question landed like a dropped plate. Carl laughed, a short sound. He said staffing assignments were flexible. He gestured to another server. He said the evening was busy. Kenji did not move. He repeated the request, this time more directly. Eyes turned. Conversations slowed. Amani felt the pull of the moment, the way attention gathered without announcement. She stepped forward before Carl could redirect again. She greeted Kenji calmly, professionally. She asked how his day had been. She did so in English, then clarified a detail in Japanese when one of his colleagues spoke. Carl's face tightened. He told Amani to return to her section. He said it sharply. Kenji looked between them. He asked in clear English if there was a reason his request could not be honored. Carl hesitated. The pause stretched. Amani felt fear rise, not of consequences, but of how easily truth could still be bent. She remained still, giving Carl space to answer. He said something about protocol, about hierarchy, about efficiency. Kenji listened, then nodded once. He said he understood protocol. He also said he valued continuity and trust. He stated calmly that he would prefer to be served by Amani, or he would take his dinner elsewhere. The room held its breath. Carl's authority wavered visibly. He glanced around, calculating. Investors were watching. Staff were watching. A choice had been forced into the open. He agreed. Amani took the table without comment. She did not allow herself a moment of triumph. She focused on the work. Throughout the meal, she moved with practiced precision. She answered questions, coordinated timing, translated when needed. The conversation at the table was serious, touching on regulatory hurdles and public accountability. Amani contributed when asked, offering insight that sharpened discussion rather than dominating it. At a nearby table, one of the restaurant's regulars watched with narrowed eyes. He leaned toward Carl during a lull and said something under his breath. Carl nodded, jaw tight. Midway through the meal, a complication arose. An order was delayed due to a kitchen error. Carl intervened abruptly, his tone accusatory. He spoke over Amani, directing blame without confirming facts. Amani responded calmly, explaining the situation clearly. She outlined the steps being taken. She did not raise her voice. Carl snapped that she was being defensive. Kenji's legal advisor looked up. He asked Carl if this was how staff were typically addressed. The question was quiet, but its effect was immediate. Carl stammered an apology, redirecting his frustration toward the kitchen. Amani felt the moment pass, but not dissipate. Later, as she cleared plates, Kenji asked her softly if she was all right. Amani answered honestly that she was managing. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. After the investors left, leaving behind measured praise and business cards, Carl called Amani into the office. The door closed. His composure cracked. He accused her of orchestrating the situation, of undermining him deliberately. He claimed she had overstepped, that her outside associations were inappropriate. Amani listened until he finished. Then she spoke. She stated, calmly and clearly, that she had followed all restaurant policies. She reminded him that he had approved her serving the table. She said she had documented their previous conversations, schedule changes, and reprimands. She said this without threat, without flourish. Carl laughed, a brittle sound. He told her documentation would not save her. Amani met his gaze. She said documentation was not about saving herself. It was about accuracy. She left the office without waiting for dismissal. That night, messages flooded in from Kenji's team. The dinner had gone well. The announcement would proceed as planned. Amani was asked to be present at the press conference the next morning. She agreed. Sleep came lightly. Her mind traced paths forward, contingencies branching and recombining. She felt shame at how long she had been expected to absorb mistreatment quietly. She felt protectiveness toward the version of herself who had learned to survive by remaining calm. She felt justice gathering shape, not yet delivered, but no longer distant. The next morning, the conference hall buzzed with activity. Cameras were set. Reporters clustered. Amani took her place among the advisory team, her posture steady. Kenji spoke of innovation, of responsibility, of the importance of mutual understanding. Questions followed, probing, skeptical. One reporter asked about workforce values, about internal culture. Kenji answered carefully. He spoke about respect, about listening to those closest to the work. He said partnerships failed when voices were dismissed. Amani felt eyes turn toward her again, curious now. Back at the restaurant, the press conference played silently on a television above the bar. Carl watched, his expression unreadable. That afternoon, upper management requested Amani's presence at a meeting. The tone of the email was formal, urgent. She arrived with her records organized, her thoughts clear. Carl was already there, along with two executives she recognized only from email signatures. They asked questions, about schedules, about reprimands, about the dinner. Amani answered each one directly. She provided dates, context, documentation. She did not embellish. She did not accuse. Carl interrupted more than once. Each time he was redirected. The meeting adjourned without resolution. Outside, Amani paused, feeling the weight of what had been set in motion. The conflict had moved beyond private corridors into shared spaces where outcomes could no longer be controlled by one voice. As she stepped back into the street, her phone buzzed with a message from Kenji. He thanked her for her professionalism. He said difficult moments revealed structure. He said the next phase would require clarity. Amani looked up at the city, the traffic flowing, indifferent and alive. She knew this was not the peak yet. The pressure was still building, the opposing forces not fully engaged. What had begun to surface would not retreat quietly. She walked forward, aware that the confrontation had only entered its first true stage, and that what followed would demand even more precision, patience, and resolve. The meeting with upper management did not end with raised voices or decisive rulings. It ended the way many pivotal moments did in institutional spaces, with polite thanks, careful wording, and the promise of review. Amani left the building with her shoulders relaxed and her hands steady, though she knew that restraint was not mercy. It was postponement. By evening, the restaurant hummed with rumors. Someone said corporate had been on the phone all afternoon. Someone else said the inspection results were being re-examined. Carl moved through the floor with exaggerated calm, offering help that no one had asked for, correcting details that did not need correction. His eyes tracked Amani whenever she crossed his line of sight. She worked her shift without deviation. Orders were accurate. Timing was precise. Guests left satisfied. Nothing on the surface justified criticism. Yet the air felt charged. Fear moved quietly, from station to station, carried in half-glances and lowered voices. Shame lingered too, not only hers, but shared, collective, the kind that came from watching unfairness and wondering how long silence could be defended as survival. After closing, Amani received a call from Kenji's legal advisor. The advisor spoke carefully, outlining developments without revealing strategy. Questions had been raised, not only about the restaurant, but about broader practices within the hospitality group that owned it. Connections were being traced, patterns examined. Amani listened, asked clarifying questions, offered context where appropriate. She did not exaggerate. She did not speculate. She knew that credibility lived in restraint. The following morning, an email arrived from corporate headquarters requesting additional documentation. The tone was neutral. The scope was broad. Amani provided what she had already prepared, attaching files with clear labels and timelines. Carl, meanwhile, escalated. He called Amani into the office before her shift, closing the door with deliberate force. He accused her of disloyalty again, of tarnishing the restaurant's image. He claimed that outside influences had compromised her judgment. Amani stood still, listening. When he paused, expecting a response, she asked if he was issuing a formal warning. The question disrupted his momentum. He said he was advising her. She nodded, thanked him, and asked that any further advisement be put in writing. His face flushed. He dismissed her abruptly. The confrontation rippled outward. Carl's authority, once assumed, now appeared brittle. Staff noticed the strain. A few began quietly sharing their own experiences with Amani, not asking her to fix anything, only wanting their stories recorded. She listened, careful not to promise outcomes she could not guarantee. Justice, she knew, was rarely swift. It was layered, procedural, often exhausting, but it depended on accumulation. Kenji's announcement dominated the news cycle for 2 days. Analysts debated the implications. Community leaders weighed potential benefits. In one interview, Kenji spoke about the importance of ethical partnerships and internal accountability. He did not name names. He did not need to. The restaurant appeared briefly in a background shot during a segment about local business ecosystems. The sign was visible. So was Carl, frozen mid-gesture, unaware of the camera. That afternoon, a representative from corporate arrived unannounced. She introduced herself as Dana, her demeanor professional and unreadable. She requested access to schedules, performance reviews, and incident reports. Carl complied, his movements tight. Dana spoke with staff individually. When she spoke with Amani, the conversation was thorough. Dana asked about workload distribution, communication practices, and decision-making authority. Amani answered calmly, providing specifics without accusation. Dana thanked her and moved on. The restaurant closed early that night under the pretense of maintenance. Staff were sent home with partial pay. Carl remained behind with Dana and another representative who arrived later. Amani walked home through streets slick with recent rain, her thoughts steady. She felt fear still, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was information. At home, she reviewed messages from Kenji. Negotiations were entering a sensitive phase. Opposition was consolidating. He asked for her insight on a potential concession. She responded with analysis that balanced pragmatism and principle. She cautioned against moves that might appear expedient but undermine long-term trust. Kenji thanked her and said he valued her perspective. The next day at the restaurant, Carl was absent. No announcement was made. His office door was closed. Dana returned, this time accompanied by a regional director. They gathered staff briefly, stating that management responsibilities would be temporarily reassigned during an internal review. The room exhaled, though no one spoke. Amani continued working, aware that absence did not equal resolution. Reviews could reverse. Decisions could be delayed. Over the following week, more information surfaced. Corporate requested interviews with former employees. Patterns extended beyond one location. The review widened. Carl returned midweek, quieter, his posture altered. He avoided Amani entirely. One evening, he confronted her near the back entrance, away from guests. His voice was low, urgent. He accused her of betrayal, of ambition masked as principle. He said she had humiliated him. Amani listened. When he finished, she said she had not acted against him. She had acted for accuracy. She reminded him that authority carried responsibility. He scoffed, then faltered. He said he had done what was expected of him. He said the system rewarded control. She did not argue. She said systems could change. He walked away. That night, Amani sat alone in her apartment, the city's glow filtering through the blinds. She allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of what she had carried. Shame surfaced, not as self-blame, but as a residue of years spent minimizing herself for others' comfort. Tenderness followed, toward that younger self, toward coworkers still navigating similar corridors. Protectiveness hardened into resolve. Revenge was not what she sought. What she wanted was justice with memory, accountability that did not vanish once attention shifted. Kenji invited her to Tokyo for a brief advisory session. The invitation was formal, the compensation generous. She considered the timing. She declined for now, explaining that she needed to see something through. Kenji understood. Corporate issued a statement acknowledging an internal review. No conclusions were announced. The restaurant operated under interim management. Policies were enforced evenly. Communication clearer. Amani noticed the difference immediately. The absence of arbitrary correction felt like relief rather than reward. Yet tension remained. One afternoon, Donna requested another meeting with Amani. This time, the questions were more pointed. Dana asked about the night of the investor dinner, about Carl's directives, about retaliation. Amani provided her records. Dana reviewed them carefully. Dana said the review was approaching a decision point. She cautioned that outcomes could be complex. She thanked Amani again. Outside, reporters gathered near the building, speculating about corporate culture within local businesses connected to larger developments. The restaurant was mentioned by name. Carl called in sick the next day. When he returned, he avoided the floor, staying in the office. Staff whispered. No one knew what would happen. Kenji's negotiations reached an impasse. A rival firm attempted to undercut terms by raising concerns about local partnerships. Amani recognized the tactic. She helped Kenji's team prepare responses that addressed concerns without defensiveness. The press conference that followed was tense. Questions sharpened. Kenji answered with composure, emphasizing transparency. Afterward, he thanked Amani privately. He said her guidance had prevented missteps. He said trust was fragile and must be protected. Back at the restaurant, Dana returned with the regional director. They requested a meeting with Carl. The door closed. Minutes stretched. Staff worked quietly, pretending not to listen. When the door opened, Carl emerged pale. He did not address anyone. He gathered personal items and left through the back. No announcement followed immediately. The shift ended in uneasy quiet. That night, Amani received an email from corporate. It stated that changes would be communicated soon. It thanked her for cooperation. She knew better than to assume outcomes. The following days were filled with waiting. Waiting tested patience more than confrontation. Doubt crept in at odd moments. Had she done enough? Had she exposed herself too much? She grounded herself in routine. She worked. She advised. She studied. Finally, a meeting was scheduled. Upper management addressed staff, announcing leadership changes and policy reviews. Language was careful. Accountability was implied rather than proclaimed. Carl's name was not mentioned. Amani listened, aware that justice often spoke in indirect terms. Afterward, Dana approached her. She said the review had substantiated concerns. She said steps were being taken to prevent recurrence. She said Amani's documentation had mattered. Amani thanked her. Outside, the city continued its indifferent motion. The conflict had not concluded. Consequences were unfolding, not finished. Power had shifted, but not settled. Kenji called later that evening. He said the next phase of negotiations would require public alignment with community values. He asked if Amani would be willing to take on a more visible role. She considered the question, aware of what visibility invited. She said she would think about it. As she ended the call, Amani stood at her window, watching lights move across the cityscape. The path ahead was still steep, the stakes higher than before. What had begun in a restaurant had grown into a confrontation with systems that resisted change even as they claimed to welcome it. She was no longer invisible. That carried its own risk. The climax had not yet reached its crest. Forces were still aligning. decisions still pending. Amani remained where she needed to be, attentive, prepared, knowing that the next movement would demand even greater clarity and courage. Visibility changed everything, but not all at once. It arrived unevenly, like a rising tide that lifted some truths while leaving others stubbornly submerged. Amani felt it in the way conversations paused when she entered rooms that had once ignored her. She felt it in the careful phrasing of emails, the sudden politeness of people who had not learned her name before. None of it felt like victory. It felt like gravity shifting. The days after the announcement were crowded with meetings. Some were formal, scheduled weeks in advance and framed as progress updates. Others appeared suddenly on her calendar, brief calls that asked for perspective without commitment. Amani accepted those that aligned with her principles and declined those that felt like attempts to soften her stance. Kenji's team requested her presence at a public forum organized by a coalition of local business leaders and labor advocates. The invitation was explicit. They wanted her to speak, not only as an advisor, but as someone whose lived experience bridged multiple worlds. The forum would be covered by local press. The questions would not be gentle. Amani spent the evening before the event reviewing notes, not rehearsing lines. She knew better than to script herself into a corner. She prepared facts, examples, and boundaries. She reminded herself that clarity did not require volume. At the restaurant, interim management introduced new procedures. Schedules were posted earlier. Feedback was documented consistently. The change felt abrupt to some, overdue to others. Amani noticed how quickly the atmosphere adjusted when unpredictability was removed. Fear loosened its grip. Carl had not returned. Rumors circulated, some contradictory, some exaggerated. Amani avoided speculation. She understood how narratives could be weaponized once momentum built. The forum took place in a community center downtown, its walls lined with photographs of past civic efforts. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly. Business owners sat beside workers, activists beside analysts. Cameras lined the back wall. Amani arrived early, greeting Kenji and several familiar faces. She took a seat near the front, listening as opening remarks set the tone. The language was aspirational, careful to acknowledge tensions without assigning blame. When her turn came, the moderator introduced her by name and role. Amani stood, feeling the room's attention settle. She spoke without embellishment, outlining how systems functioned differently depending on where one stood within them. She described the cost of misunderstanding, not as an abstract concept, but as something that shaped outcomes, decisions, and dignity. She did not recount every detail. She did not center herself as a symbol. She focused on process, on how small decisions accumulated into cultures that either sustained trust or eroded it. Questions followed. One attendee asked how organizations could balance efficiency with humanity. Amani answered that efficiency without listening often created waste disguised as speed. Another asked about accountability. Amani said accountability required records, transparency, and the willingness to examine discomfort without defensiveness. A reporter asked whether recent events at the restaurant had influenced her views. Amani paused. She acknowledged that personal experience informed perspective, but she redirected to broader patterns. She refused to turn a complex issue into a spectacle. The room responded with thoughtful silence, then applause. Afterward, people approached her with thanks, with questions, with offers. She accepted business cards, not commitments. She understood the difference. That evening, Kenji expressed appreciation. He said her voice had grounded the conversation. He asked again about a more visible role, this time framing it as partnership rather than assistance. Amani asked for time. The restaurant's corporate office issued a follow-up statement. Leadership changes were confirmed. Policy revisions outlined. Training initiatives announced. The language was precise, cautious, legal. Amani read it carefully. She noted what was said and what was not. Dana called the next day. She said the review had concluded. She said findings supported the need for change. She said corrective actions were underway. She did not offer apologies. She did not need to. Amani thanked her and asked about protections for staff who had come forward. Dana assured her measures were in place. At work, Amani noticed subtle shifts in how she was addressed. Some coworkers sought her advice openly now. Others kept their distance, unsure how proximity to scrutiny might affect them. Amani remained consistent, refusing to trade one imbalance for another. One afternoon, Maya approached her, relief evident in her posture. She said the environment felt safer. She said she was considering applying for a supervisory role she had previously dismissed as unattainable. Amani encouraged her to try. Kenji's negotiations reached a turning point. A major outlet published an in-depth piece examining the partnership's potential impact, including a section on internal accountability. Amani was quoted, briefly, accurately. Public reaction was mixed, as it always was. Praise and skepticism traveled side by side. Then Carl resurfaced. The message arrived unexpectedly, an email sent late at night. It was short, formal. He requested a meeting, citing a desire to clarify misunderstandings. Amani read it twice. She felt a flicker of something old rise, then settle. She considered the implications. She did not owe him closure. She also understood the power of direct exchange when conducted on her terms. She replied, agreeing to meet in a public place during the day. They met at a quiet cafe near the river. Carl arrived early, seated stiffly. He looked smaller than she remembered, tension drawn tight across his face. They exchanged greetings. Amani waited. Carl spoke first. He said the situation had spiraled beyond his control. He said he had been following expectations. He said pressure came from above. Amani listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she asked what outcome he wanted from the conversation. He hesitated. He said he wanted his reputation restored. Amani responded carefully. She said reputation followed behavior. She said systems could apply pressure, but choices still belonged to individuals. She said accountability was not humiliation, but it was not optional. Carl bristled, then deflated. He said he felt betrayed. Amani met his eyes. She said she had documented events to protect accuracy, not to target him. She said harm did not require intent to be real. The conversation ended without resolution. It did not need one. As they parted, Amani felt neither triumph nor regret. She felt clarity. In the days that followed, attention intensified. Requests for speaking engagements increased. So did criticism from those who felt threatened by scrutiny. Amani chose carefully where to engage. Kenji invited her to join his firm's advisory council formally. The offer included authority, compensation, and visibility. It also included expectations. Amani negotiated terms that preserved independence. She accepted. At the restaurant, a new general manager was appointed. She introduced herself to staff with openness and specificity. She asked for feedback and followed through. Amani noticed how leadership tone cascaded. Corrections became collaborative. Praise became public. Still, not everything smoothed over. Resentment lingered in corners. Change rarely erased discomfort. One evening, a customer attempted to belittle Amani with condescension masked as humor. The moment hung, familiar. Amani responded calmly, setting boundaries with professionalism. The customer backed down, embarrassed. A coworker later thanked her for modeling restraint without submission. Kenji's partnership was finalized pending final approvals. The announcement date loomed. Media interest surged again. Amani prepared for questions that would revisit earlier conflicts. She refined language that emphasized principles rather than personalities. At the announcement event, cameras flashed. Kenji spoke of innovation and responsibility. When Amani was introduced, the applause was respectful, measured. A reporter asked whether her experience at the restaurant had shaped the partnership's values. Amani answered that values were revealed under pressure. She said growth required willingness to listen when it was uncomfortable. The answer traveled. Afterward, in a quiet hallway, Kenji thanked her for standing firm when retreat would have been easier. He said her perspective had changed outcomes. Amani acknowledged the partnership. She did not internalize the praise. Back home that night, she allowed herself to rest. The past months replayed in fragments. The first misunderstanding, the quiet corrections, the documentation, the waiting. Fear had been constant, but so had resolve shaped by patience rather than force. She thought of justice not as a single act, but as sustained attention. The next morning brought new emails, new calendars. The work was not finished. Systems adapted, resisted, recalibrated. Amani stepped into the day aware that the climax had not been a single confrontation, but a convergence. Forces had collided, but their aftermath would unfold slowly. She was ready for what followed, not because everything was settled, but because she had learned how to stand within uncertainty without surrendering clarity. The story continued, its next movement already forming, carrying the weight of what had been revealed and the responsibility of what would come after. After the announcement event, the pace of Amani's days changed, not by slowing, but by settling into a steadier rhythm. The sharp peaks of confrontation gave way to long stretches of adjustment, where consequences unfolded quietly and systems tested their own promises. This was the part few people noticed from the outside, the part that did not lend itself to headlines. At the restaurant, new routines took hold. The general manager held weekly check-ins, brief and structured. Concerns were logged and followed up on, not perfectly, but consistently. Amani observed the shift with cautious attention. She knew that policy could be announced in a day and eroded over months. Still, the atmosphere no longer carried the same tension that once pressed against her shoulders. Her schedule stabilized. Hours returned, evenly distributed. No one framed it as a favor. It was simply normal now. That, more than any apology, mattered. Some coworkers approached her with gratitude. Others maintained a careful distance, unsure whether closeness would draw attention. Amani treated everyone the same. She had no interest in becoming a symbol that replaced one imbalance with another. Maya was promoted to a supervisory role after a short interview process. When she told Amani, her voice shook with excitement and disbelief. Amani congratulated her without making the moment about herself. Watching someone else step into opportunity felt like a quiet affirmation that change could ripple outward. Outside the restaurant, Amani's work with Kenji's firm expanded in scope but narrowed in focus. Her role became clearer, defined by boundaries she had negotiated deliberately. She attended fewer meetings, but those she did attend carried weight. Her input was sought early rather than as a corrective after decisions were made. She noticed the difference immediately. Being invited at the beginning changed everything. The press attention eased, moving on to the next story cycle. Articles were archived, opinions cooled. The absence of constant scrutiny felt strange at first, like stepping into a room after a noise had stopped. Amani welcomed the quiet, even as she remained alert to what silence could hide. Carl's absence became permanent. A brief internal memo announced a separation, framed in neutral language. There were no details, no commentary. The system closed ranks as it often did, protecting itself while adjusting its surface. Amani did not feel satisfaction at the news. What she felt was release, the loosening of a tension she had carried for so long that its weight had seemed normal. She continued documenting her workdays out of habit, though the entries grew shorter. Fewer incidents required precision. More moments were simply ordinary. Kenji traveled back and forth between the United States and Japan. When he was in the city, they met in person. When he was not, they spoke across time zones. Their conversations shifted away from crisis management toward long-term planning, infrastructure projects, workforce integration, community partnerships. Amani insisted on including local voices early in discussions. She suggested listening sessions, not as gestures, but as sources of information. Some executives resisted at first, wary of unpredictability. Kenji supported her position. The sessions revealed concerns that spreadsheets could not. Fears about displacement. Skepticism shaped by past promises left unkept. Amani facilitated without dominating, translating not just language but intent. She recognized parts of herself in those rooms, in the careful questions and guarded hope. It reinforced her belief that intelligence, when paired with listening, could alter trajectories without spectacle. At home, her routines shifted as well. She slept more regularly. She cooked meals instead of grabbing whatever was quickest. She returned to studies she had set aside during the height of conflict, exploring topics for curiosity rather than defense. Ambition remained, but it felt less like escape and more like direction. One evening, she returned to the restaurant as a guest for the first time since everything had changed. She chose a quiet table, ordered simply. The staff greeted her warmly, but without deference. The balance felt right. As she ate, she watched the flow of service, noting improvements and lingering inefficiencies. Systems, she knew, were living things. They required attention, not assumption. The manager stopped by her table and asked, casually, if everything was satisfactory. Amani smiled and said it was. Walking home afterward, she felt the city around her with new clarity, not as an adversary to navigate defensively, but as a landscape of intersecting paths. Some remained blocked. Others had opened unexpectedly. Kenji invited her to Tokyo again, this time with flexibility around timing and scope. Amani considered it carefully. She did not rush to answer. Opportunity no longer felt like something that might vanish if not seized immediately. She wrote a list, not of pros and cons, but of values she was unwilling to compromise. Respect, accuracy, autonomy. She compared the invitation against that list. The answer began to take shape, though she did not voice it yet. At the restaurant, a new hire struggled during a busy shift. Amani noticed the familiar signs of overwhelm. She offered guidance quietly, stepping in where needed without taking over. Later, the new hire thanked her, relief evident. Amani recognized herself in that moment too, the version that had once needed support without judgment. The labor advocate she had consulted earlier checked in. He said the case had been cited internally as an example of effective documentation. He asked if she would consider contributing to a training module. Amani said she would review the proposal. Time moved differently now. Days felt full but not frantic. The emotional residue of the conflict surfaced occasionally, triggered by a tone or a memory, but it no longer controlled her reactions. She allowed herself tenderness when it arose, acknowledging the cost of what she had endured without letting it define her. Justice, she reflected, was rarely loud at the end. It settled into new norms, into what people expected from one another. It lived in prevention as much as correction. As summer edged closer, the city brightened. Outdoor meetings replaced conference rooms. Conversations stretched longer. Amani stood at the intersection of multiple worlds, no longer forced to choose invisibility as protection. She was aware that the story was not complete, that resolutions did not arrive as clean breaks but as gradual recalibrations. What lay ahead would require patience of a different kind, the patience to build rather than resist. She was ready for that work, grounded not in reaction, but in intention. The path forward remained open, shaped by decisions still to be made, lessons still settling into place. The falling tension did not signal an end, only a shift toward something more enduring, where meaning would be measured not by confrontation, but by what endured after it. By the time summer settled fully into the city, the shape of Amani's life no longer felt provisional. The uncertainty that had once hovered at the edges of every decision had receded, replaced by a sense of grounded continuity. Not permanence, she knew better than that, but coherence. The parts of her life no longer pulled against one another. Her answer to Kenji's invitation took form quietly. She accepted a hybrid role, splitting her time between advisory work abroad and continued engagement with community initiatives at home. The arrangement respected her boundaries and acknowledged her value without demanding erasure of the life she had built. When she signed the agreement, she felt neither triumph nor disbelief, only readiness. The restaurant remained part of her world longer than many expected. She did not leave abruptly or dramatically. She trained new staff, supported Maya in her expanded role, and watched systems take root that no longer depended on one person's vigilance. When she eventually gave notice, it was received with professionalism and sincere appreciation. Her final shift ended without ceremony, just a handshake from the manager and warm goodbyes from coworkers who now stood a little straighter than before. Walking out that last evening, Amani paused at the door. She looked back once, not with bitterness but with acknowledgement. That space had tested her in ways no classroom ever could. It had sharpened her understanding of power, of silence, of when patience served justice and when it protected harm. She carried those lessons with her, not as scars, but as tools. Her work with Kenji's firm deepened. Projects moved from planning into implementation. Community listening sessions evolved into advisory councils with real authority. Amani helped design frameworks that required accountability not as an afterthought, but as a condition of growth. She insisted on language access, on feedback loops, on measurable commitments. Some resisted. Others adapted. Change was uneven, but it was real. The labor advocate invited her to co-author a set of best practices based on documented cases, including anonymized elements of her own experience. The work was meticulous and slow, but it mattered. It translated lived complexity into guidance that others could use without reliving the harm. Amani spoke occasionally at universities and forums, not as a keynote figure, but as a practitioner. She emphasized preparation over brilliance, documentation over outrage, and collective progress over individual recognition. Students listened closely. Some stayed after to ask questions that revealed familiar fears. She answered them honestly. At home, her life expanded in quieter ways. She reconnected with friends she had kept at arm's length during the conflict. She traveled not as escape, but as exchange. Languages she had learned in isolation now lived in conversation, laughter, disagreement. One evening, while visiting Tokyo for a series of meetings, Kenji invited her to dinner at a small restaurant tucked away from the city's busiest streets. The owner greeted them warmly, switching languages with ease. The meal unfolded without tension or misunderstanding. Halfway through, Kenji raised his glass and thanked Amani, not for translating words, but for insisting on meaning. He said her presence had changed how he led. She accepted the gratitude without shrinking or deflecting. Later, walking back through the city lights, Amani reflected on how far she had come from that first afternoon when confusion and dismissal had collided. The revenge she had once imagined, sharp and satisfying, had transformed into something steadier. Justice, she realized, was not about reversal of roles, but about reshaping conditions so fewer people had to endure what she had. News of the restaurant's reforms circulated quietly within the industry. Other locations adopted similar policies. It was not celebrated publicly, but it endured. One afternoon, months later, Amani received a message from Maya. The restaurant had just completed its first year without a single formal grievance filed. Staff turnover was down. Customer satisfaction up. Maya thanked her for believing change was possible. Amani smiled at the screen, feeling a tenderness she did not rush away. Carl's name surfaced once more, indirectly, in a professional context unrelated to her life. She felt no urge to engage, no satisfaction in distance. The chapter was closed, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been understood. As time passed, Amani's story became less about what she had endured and more about what she built. She invested in mentorship programs, particularly for young people whose intelligence was often overlooked because it arrived in unexpected forms. She emphasized that calm did not mean consent, and that knowing one's worth did not require announcing it. On an autumn evening, she returned to Seattle after weeks abroad. The city greeted her with familiar rain. She stood at her apartment window, watching reflections ripple across the street, and felt a sense of arrival that had nothing to do with geography. Her journey had not elevated her above others. It had anchored her more deeply among them. The memory of the restaurant remained, not as a wound, but as a turning point. A place where she had chosen patience without surrender, ambition without cruelty, justice without spectacle. A place where being underestimated had become an advantage she wielded with precision. No one had understood the Japanese CEO that day until she spoke up. Fewer people had understood her until much later. But understanding, once earned, had changed more than a single moment. It had altered paths. Amani closed her laptop, turned off the light, and let the quiet settle. The story, now complete, did not end in silence, but in continuity. A life aligned with its values, moving forward with clarity, purpose, and a calm strength that no one could take away.